Tonight, the demise of a great American institution.
See the USA in your Chevrolet.
General Motors, whose classic cars once dominated the highways, towed into bankruptcy by the U.S. government.
Our goal is to get GM back on its feet, take a hands-off approach, and get out quickly.
I'm Katie Couric. Also tonight, the search for Flight 447. An Air France jetliner with 228 on board vanishes during a lightning storm over the Atlantic. Who is the man arrested in the murder of a Kansas doctor who performed late-term abortions? And in these economic hard times, finding a fortune where you'd least expect it.
Whoa, there's a gold mine in your closet.
This is the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric.
Good evening, everyone. Those of us who grew up when General Motors ruled the road never imagined we'd see this day, the day GM filed for bankruptcy. But it is staying in business for now, owned largely by you and me, the taxpayers. As the company reorganizes, it will close 14 plants. The U.S. government will take a 60% ownership stake, and the goal is to have it out of bankruptcy within 90 days. President Obama sounded a bit like salesman-in-chief today, telling Americans, if you're considering buying a GM car, your warranties will be backed by the government. Anthony Mason begins our coverage.
When lawyers wheeled the bankruptcy papers into a New York courtroom this morning, it was the end of the road for an American icon.
It's not just any company we're talking about. It's GM.
GM, which has been kept alive with $20 billion in taxpayer money, will need another $30 billion from the government to get through bankruptcy.
Our goal is to get GM back on its feet, take a hands-off approach, and get out quickly.
As part of its restructuring, GM will cut another 21,000 jobs and close 40% of its 6,000 dealerships.
The GM that many of you knew, the GM that, in fact, had let too many of you down, is history.
As the company tries to reinvent itself, it'll unveil a new ad campaign this week.
This is not about going out of business. This is about getting down to business.
But the new GM will be a shadow of its former self.
See the USA in your Chevrolet.
The industrial giant that for much of the past century drove American prosperity.
Prosperity greater than history has ever known.
As GM goes, it was said, so goes the country. And for decades, it was true. In the early 1960s, GM made more than half of all the automobiles sold in this country. At its peak in 1979, it was the country's largest employer with 600,000 workers. By next year, it'll have just 60,000 employees in the U.S. GM's pit stop in bankruptcy court comes just as the U.S. economy seemed to be heading for a turnaround.
How much is this going to slow that down?
Well, I think you can argue that the GM bankruptcy will knock another couple 100,000 jobs out of the economy at the very least, and so it comes at a bad time. It'll slow things down.
But the taxpayers now own General Motors.
Just last week, Car and Driver named me Auto Executive of the Year.
That was only a joke, the president insisted today.
What I have no interest in doing is running GM.
Do you consider yourself a government employee now?
No, I don't.
But CEO Fritz Henderson knows who'll be looking over his shoulder.
I will be judged by the shareholders of the company, which would be the government, U.S. or the Canadian government.
Together, they'll own 72% of the surviving GM.
And a top GM official today acknowledged holding nightly phone meetings with the president's auto task force. Meanwhile, bankruptcy will wipe out GM shareholders. Their stock is now worthless. Katie?
So, Anthony, is the government just trying to make GM profitable, or will it be telling them what kind of cars to manufacture?
Well, the president is pushing the entire industry, Katie, into smaller, more fuel-efficient, greener cars. But I don't expect the government's going to be in on GM's design meetings. But GM has to have heard what its biggest shareholder wants at this point.
So, can GM be profitable making greener cars?
That's the real question, because Detroit has been making its money in recent years off of bigger cars, off of SUVs, off of trucks. This strategy, for a lot of people, is very questionable.
All right, Anthony Mason. Anthony, thank you. The human toll of GM's bankruptcy will be felt all across the country, especially where there's a GM dealership or factory. The 14 plants that are closing are in 7 states. Half of those are in Michigan. From Detroit tonight, here's Dean Reynolds.
Mike Dursa, general manager of a GM dealership outside Detroit, was actually relieved to get the bad news.
We're relieved, obviously, because General Motors is still here.
Dursa's dealership will survive in the new GM world, unlike the 2,600 dealers who won't. And he sounds as optimistic as a car salesman can be these days.
Yes, we're in bankruptcy. Yes, we'll come out of this a lot stronger, and it's going to be a very short amount of time, too.
That can't happen fast enough for supplier Mike Asnavorian of Clips and Clamps Industries, which has been whipsawed with shrinking orders from both GM and Chrysler.
We're expected to be down 75% from our normal sales last year.
In the last year, the workday here has been cut in half. The number of workers has dropped from 60 to 20, and those left have had their pay cut by 20%.
Keep up the good work.
Mike says letting people go was traumatic, but inevitable.
When we laid these people off, I want to tell you, not one of them argued. Okay, not one of them thought it was just horrendous that we were doing that.
At GM, they could see it coming, but it didn't make it any easier.
Why us? Was my first feeling.
I felt kind of let down a little bit, you know. It's like, you know, I'm losing my job, you know, my means of support right now.
It's just a damn shame. We've been betrayed here. We've been betrayed by politicians that are doing things not in the best interest of the working class here.
In Spring Hill, Tennessee, where an entire community sprouted around the Saturn factory, the plant won't close, but its 2,500 workers will be idled indefinitely, as will the 2,000 workers at the plant in Lake Orion, Michigan, where Brian Yarbrough, a third-generation GM worker, brought home the bad news.
It's a different type of reality. It's, just, survive.
It may turn out to be a new beginning for GM, but for many who helped build it, today is a sad ending. Dean Reynolds, CBS News, Detroit.
GM stock closed today at 75 cents a share, right where it was on Friday. The market overall rallied today, though, the Dow soaring more than 200 points as investors focused on some positive economic news. There seems to be some improvement in the manufacturing sector. By the way, with GM in bankruptcy, some changes are coming to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. GM is being replaced by Cisco Systems, and Citigroup is also getting yanked. Travelers will take its place. Now to another developing story tonight, the mysterious disappearance of an Air France jetliner over the Atlantic. CBS News has learned the U.S. military is preparing to use some of its satellites to search for Flight 447. The plane with more than 200 people on board was en route from Rio de Janeiro to Paris last night when it ran into a violent storm and vanished. Air France says it presumes the plane crashed in the Atlantic. The latest from Mark Phillips.
For the relatives of those aboard the plane who gathered at Rio's airport, this was the worst sort of air disaster, one that is a complete mystery. Air France Flight 447, a 4-year-old Airbus A330, left Rio at 6:30 yesterday evening Eastern Time with 228 passengers and crew on board, bound for Paris. It had recently been serviced and was in the hands of a highly experienced cockpit team. The flight seemed perfectly normal as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet 3.5 hours later over the island chain of Fernando de Noronha off the coast. Here, as expected, it left Brazilian radar range and was not due to show up on radar screens again until it got near Africa. The flight then encountered severe turbulence as it passed through a zone of thunder and lightning storms, and the plane automatically sent out a series of messages indicating that various onboard systems were malfunctioning. This was the last that was heard of Air France 447. Search planes from Brazil, France, and Spain headed to the area. The French even asked the United States to try to use spy satellites to look for the plane. But the search area is about the size of the continental United States.
What the French government is trying to get is any information which could have been gathered by satellite system of US, if anything can help.
Air France says it cannot at this point establish a direct link between the severe weather and the disappearance of the plane, but that is what everyone here is wondering.
It's the first time that the strike will destroy an aircraft. We can't believe that. We can't believe that.
Relatives of those on board are being cared for by Air France, who have brought in a team of psychologists to offer counseling. Family in Brazil were being helped there as well.
Air France says that while the majority of those on board were French, there were 32 different nationalities represented, including 2 Americans. The great fear here is that with this plane disappearing in the mid-Atlantic, its flight data recorder boxes may now be on the bottom of the ocean, and the exact cause of this crash may never be known. Katie.
Mark Phillips in Paris tonight. Thank you. The Pentagon said today it's seen no evidence that terrorism is involved. Investigators are looking into many factors, including the weather. But could a lightning strike really bring down a passenger jet? We asked Nancy Cordes to take a closer look.
Lightning strikes can be catastrophic on the ground, but in aviation they are a daily and uneventful occurrence. That's because jets like the Airbus A330 are built with materials that shed lightning charges and come equipped with redundant electrical systems. If one shorts out, another takes its place.
It's a little bit of an adventure for a moment because it's like a flashbulb going off in your face. But beyond that, that wasn't a big concern for us.
What does concern aviation experts is that unlike the pilots in the Swiss air crash off Nova Scotia in '98, the result of an electrical malfunction that started a fire, the Air France crew never had time to issue a single mayday. Though the plane reportedly sent out an automated signal that it was losing cabin pressure almost 7 miles above the ocean.
That could be the indication, an ominous indication that this plane was coming apart.
Peter Goltz, who participated in the search for TWA Flight 800 off Long Island in '96, fears this jet may never be found.
In TWA 800, we knew where the plane went down. We had a debris field. We had eyewitnesses, and it still took us 4 or 5 days to even find the beginnings of the wreckage field.
And that was in water that was just 200 feet deep. This jet disappeared over open ocean that plunges to 10,000 feet in some places, Katie.
Such a tragedy. Nancy Cordes. Nancy, thank you. Now to the nomination of Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court. She goes to Capitol Hill tomorrow to visit key senators from both parties. Today, she was at the White House going over her Senate questionnaire, which examines her background as well as her public statements and political activities. President Obama expects the Senate to confirm Judge Sotomayor before its August vacation. Still ahead here on the CBS Evening News, the 2009 version of Let's Make a Deal. Someone may be willing to pay for what's behind your closet door. But up next, the Attorney General orders tighter security for abortion providers after the murder of a doctor. Now the latest on the murder of Dr. George Tiller, gunned down in a Wichita, Kansas church. Tonight, federal marshals are guarding other abortion providers under orders from Attorney General Eric Holder. Tiller's clinic in Wichita is now closed temporarily, and police are looking into the background of the 51-year-old suspect. More on that from Jeff Glor.
This is anti-government activist Scott Roeder in 1996, accused of possessing bomb-making materials. He was convicted but released when a court ruled his car was illegally searched. The next time he came across authorities was on the side of a highway near Kansas City on Sunday, under suspicion of murder. His ex-wife, who did not want her face shown, said he was obsessed with fighting abortion.
I think he thinks he's right, and that he was justified in doing what he's done.
A 2007 posting on an anti-abortion website under the name Scott Roeder called for the closing of Dr. George Tiller's death camp, comparing him to the Nazi concentration camp Dr. Joseph Mengele, continuing, would it be feasible to organize people to attend Tiller's church? On Sunday, police say Roeder organized a group of one, assassinating the 67-year-old Tiller with a handgun in the church lobby just after services began. Tiller was serving as an usher, his wife of 45 years singing in the choir.
Picketed since 1975. My office has been blown up. We have had 4,000 people arrested outside my office in 1991. 1993, I survived an assassination attempt.
Tiller was one of only a handful of doctors performing late-term abortions after the 21st week of pregnancy, Supporters say only when the mother's life was at risk or when the child had a severe genetic disorder.
He wanted to go out there and help people in desperate circumstances.
But controversial nonetheless.
Pro-life leaders and the pro-life movement are not responsible for George Tiller's death. George Tiller was a mass murderer, and horrifically, he reaped what he sowed.
Friends of Tiller, a father to 4 and grandfather of 10, say he knew the dangers.
Was he frightened? I never saw him flinch or a moment of fear. He was very committed to his patients.
The threat against Tiller was so constant, his clinic had fortress-like security, round-the-clock guards and surveillance cameras. And when he left here, he often traveled with a bodyguard in a bulletproof vehicle.
Whatever the motivation for this heinous act, the act itself will have a chilling effect on other healthcare professionals who may be too afraid to become involved in women's rights.
But tonight, just as those close to George Tiller mourn his loss, another doctor is making his way from Nebraska to take his place. Jeff Glor, CBS News, Wichita.
Meanwhile, the FBI says murders and other violent crimes are becoming less common. A new report shows a 2.5% drop in 2008 from the year before, when about 1.4 million violent crimes were reported. Murder and manslaughter fell more than 4%. Still ahead, an international superstar comes crashing down.
A mysterious charity with a Washington connection, spending your tax dollars.
I'm asking you not to take any pictures, all right?
We'll follow the money tomorrow on the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric.
In these tough economic times, some people are finding creative ways to stay afloat. John Blackstone shows us what happens when people looking to make a few dollars are matched with others looking to save a few in tonight's Bright Spots.
In San Francisco, John Fast has found a way to make money from things like his bike and his Wii video game. When he's not using things, instead of leaving them sitting in a closet, he rents them. The Wii can bring in some real money.
It's $30 for a day, $50 for a weekend.
Dorinda Vassig rented it for a weekend.
I was babysitting my niece, and she gets bored and antsy a little bit, and I didn't want to buy a Wii.
The two San Franciscans made their rental deal on Zillock.com, a website whose founder has a motto.
There's a gold mine in your closet.
Whoa. Jeff Boudier and some friends back home in Paris came up with the idea when they needed a drill to hang a mirror.
We didn't want to buy a whole new drill.
They ended up doing their own research, which Boudier says showed that 80% of what people own, they use just once a month. As for that drill...
And it turns out that a drill is used an average of 12 minutes over its whole lifetime.
That led to the creation of Zillock, sort of an eBay for renters. The idea is to connect people who live close to each other, like Tobias Coons and Manuela Bastos in New York. He uses his camera only on vacation. She needed a good camera for one day for a party. He made $42. She saved a bundle.
Yeah, I think it's a really great alternative to buying something.
Right now, Zillock's users are concentrated in just 5 major cities. The site has 110,000 items listed for rent.
Eventually, we want you to find anything, anywhere in the United States that you would like to rent. And for that, we need 10 million items.
An ambitious goal, but consider this. Across the country, some 23 million storage units are stuffed with stuff we're not using. There could be a gold mine in there. John Blackstone, CBS News, Marin County, California.
This Bright Spots is sponsored by Priority Mail Flat Rate Boxes, only from the Postal Service. A simpler way to ship.
Finally tonight, it comes out of nowhere and lights up the night sky for one brief, exciting moment, then disappears. It's the story of a shooting star and the downside of white-hot celebrity. Some say it's the story of Susan Boyle. Here's Richard Roth.
I dreamed a dream in time gone by.
Over 7 weeks, the YouTube sensation was transformed into a genuine celebrity.
And when Susan Boyle sang in the talent show final Saturday night, almost a third of Britain was watching on TV. 19 million people tuned in to see the improbable star come right to the brink of finishing first.
The winner is...
and come in second.
Diversity!
To a high-energy dance group. Susan Boyle's only prize was praise.
You had the guts to come back here tonight, face your critics, and you beat them.
She may have beat the critics with a smile and a shuffle, but within hours, a candid photo showed a different face. And she was checked in, exhausted and emotionally drained, her handlers said, to a private mental clinic. Her voice coach said she was just a vulnerable woman, an innocent caught up in the fame game. He still carries a letter she wrote him.
Dear Fred, you're the first person to say that you like me. I've been crying ever since. No one's ever told me that before.
Friends and family say Boyle's resting now, but doing fine, out of the spotlight. Richard Roth, CBS News, London.
And that is the CBS Evening News for tonight. I'm Katie Couric. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.